Good evening. This is Fear NOX. Tonight you will hear accounts from people who do not scare easily. Hunters, landowners, early morning watchers, and locals who know the ridges and hollows better than their own kitchens. These are voices that usually stay steady. People trained to identify shapes, sounds, distance, until something steps outside every rule they rely on. What they describe is quiet, close, and unmistakably wrong. Moments where instinct overrules experience, where breath hangs in the air, and the mind refuses to believe what the body already knows. Subscribe and hit the bell. If you have ever been out there before first light and felt something waiting in the fog with you, this one is for you. All right, let us get into it. I was in my ladder stand before first light, positioned above a long pasture. The autumn air was barely above freezing, and a thick fog had settled in the low ground. I noticed the fog line was unusually distinct, a perfect horizontal stripe across the field. My routine began long before dawn. I parked my truck on the gravel logging road, the headlights cutting through the pre-dawn darkness. The walk to the stand was familiar, a short trail through the hardwoods. I carried my rifle and a handheld radio, checking the batteries before leaving the cabin. The forest was quiet, save for the rustle of dry leaves underfoot and the distant hum of the highway. I climbed the stand slowly, the metal creaking softly under my weight. From my vantage point, the pasture stretched out below, a pale, indistinct expanse swallowed by the mist. I settled in, securing my rifle and scanning the area. My partners were spread across the block, each in their designated stand, all aware of the safety protocols. We always confirmed our positions and checked in periodically. This was standard procedure, a part of the isolation of the hunt. The fog was dense, a solid white blanket that obscured the lower half of the pasture. Above it, the ridge line was a dark silhouette against the slowly lightening sky. I could hear the faint calls of crows beginning their day, a familiar sound in the cold morning. My breath plumed in the frigid air. I pulled my blaze-orange vest tighter, ensuring maximum visibility. The visibility chart I carried indicated that at this fog depth, any movement above the mist line would be clear. I ran through my mental checklist, confirming my shooting lanes and potential targets. The air was still, holding the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. I had been hunting this area for many seasons, and the landscape felt like a second home. The quiet dread of the unknown was not typically part of the experience. It was usually a peaceful solitude. As the sky began to lighten, a faint orange glow appeared on the eastern horizon. The fog, however, remained stubbornly thick, clinging to the contours of the land. It formed a perfectly level surface, like a vast, still lake. Then I saw it. A dark form, barely discernible against the pale mist, appeared at the far end of the pasture. It was walking, moving slowly along the very top edge of the fog band. The figure was upright, clearly bipedal, and seemed to glide rather than step. It was too far for precise detail, but its silhouette was unmistakably human-shaped. My first thought was that a partner had somehow misjudged their position, or was moving outside of protocol. I immediately raised my binoculars. Through the glass, the figure remained indistinct, a dark, featureless shape. It wore no blaze orange. This was a critical violation of safety rules, especially during hunting season. The figure continued its slow, deliberate pace, maintaining a precise line along the upper boundary of the fog. It did not deviate, did not rise above the mist, nor did it dip into it. It was as if the fog line itself was a track it was compelled to follow. I watched for several minutes, my rifle resting across my lap, not aimed. My heart rate began to pick up, a cold knot forming in my stomach. I tried to rationalize what I was seeing. Perhaps it was a local hiker, though this area was strictly for hunting, and the lack of blaze was concerning. Perhaps it was a game warden, but they would be clearly marked and would likely have announced their presence. I reached for my handheld radio, a standard model with a clear channel for our hunting club. I pressed the transmit button. Alpha 1 to any station, do you copy? I waited, listening to the static. A moment later, I heard a crackle. Bravo 2 copies, Alpha 1. Go ahead. It was Mark, positioned on the north ridge. Bravo 2, I have an unidentified individual moving along the fog line in the pasture below my stand. No blaze. Do you have eyes on anyone in that area? I kept my voice calm, factual. Mark's reply came back quickly. Negative, Alpha 1. All clear on my side. Everyone accounted for. Is it moving towards you? I described the figure's movement, its unwavering path along the fog. It's moving west, parallel to the ridge, still on the fog line. No response to visual cues. I had tried waving my hand, even making a soft, non-threatening call, but the figure had given no indication it had seen or heard me. It simply continued its silent, measured walk. The silence was unnerving. There was no sound of footsteps, no rustle of clothing, nothing to indicate a living person. The figure was simply there, a dark, moving shadow against the pale, still fog. I checked the radio again. Charlie 3, Delta 4, do you copy? Any movement in the pasture? Both confirmed they were in their stands, no one else in their sight lines. All partners were accounted for, and no one was moving. The figure was now closer, perhaps a few hundred yards away. I could see its form more clearly, though still without distinct features. It was tall, slender, and moved with an unsettling fluidity. It did not appear to be looking around, its head held steady, facing forward. The lack of any identifying features, coupled with the complete silence and the precise adherence to the fog line, began to shift my unease into something colder, more primal. This was not a lost hiker. This was not a game warden. This was something else. The cold air felt sharper, the isolation of my stand more pronounced. I lowered my binoculars, then raised them again, trying to find some detail, some explanation. There was none. Just the dark, silent form pacing the edge of the mist. I made a decision. I needed to get a closer look, but not from my stand. I needed to be on the ground, to investigate the area where it had been. I radioed Mark again. Bravo 2, I am descending my stand. I will approach the fog line from the east, where the figure originated. Maintain radio contact. Mark acknowledged, his voice tinged with concern. Copy, Alpha 1. Be careful. Keep me updated. I slowly, deliberately, unloaded my rifle and secured it. My hands were steady, but the cold knot in my stomach had tightened. I descended the ladder, each creak of the metal amplified in the quiet forest. My boots hit the damp earth, and I moved cautiously, keeping to the tree line. I moved through the underbrush, my eyes fixed on the fog line. The figure was now out of my direct sight, having moved further west. I reached the edge of the pasture where the figure had first appeared. The ground was damp, covered in a thin layer of frost. I scanned for tracks, for any sign of passage. There was nothing. The frost was undisturbed. The grass was flattened in places, but this was from the natural settling of the fog, not from footsteps. The lack of evidence was as unsettling as the sighting itself. I walked slowly along the edge of the pasture, moving in the direction the figure had taken. The fog remained a solid, impenetrable wall to my left. The air was heavy, still. I felt a profound sense of isolation, despite knowing my partners were nearby. I continued my search for a good half hour, covering the area where the figure had walked. I found no broken twigs, no disturbed leaves, no impressions in the damp earth. It was as if the figure had left no trace, had simply glided over the surface without contact. The sun was now fully risen, casting long shadows through the trees. The fog, however, showed no signs of dissipating. It remained a stark, white line across the field. I radioed Mark again. "Bravo 2, I have found no evidence of passage. No tracks, no disturbed ground. The area is clear." Mark's voice was quiet. "Understood, Alpha 1. Are you returning to your stand?" I considered it. The thought of climbing back into the stand, overlooking that empty, silent fog, was not appealing. "Negative, Bravo 2. I am returning to the truck. I will meet you at the cabin." I walked back to my truck, the gravel crunching under my boots. The forest felt different now, less welcoming. The hum of the highway seemed more distant, the isolation more profound. I filed a report with the local game warden's office later that day. I described the incident factually, without embellishment. The warden listened patiently, taking notes. He assured me they would investigate, checking for any unauthorized activity in the area. A search was conducted, but no evidence of any individual or unusual activity was ever found. The incident was logged, a brief entry in a file, an unexplained observation. My partners and I reviewed our radio log, confirming all check-ins and the lack of any missing persons reports. The official report concluded with no findings. There was no evidence, no explanation. I still hunt that block, but I never look at the fog the same way. The memory of that dark, silent figure, walking with such precise, unwavering purpose along the top edge of the mist, remains clear. I still hear the static sometimes, the quiet hum of the radio, and I wonder what it was that walked that line. I was with my hunting partner, Mark, before dawn. We were positioned on a logging landing in the Appalachian foothills. A thick, contour-hugging fog had settled over the area, obscuring visibility. Our routine was established over many seasons. We would arrive well before first light, park the truck a short distance down the gravel skid road, and walk in. This particular landing was cut into a hardwood slope, offering a clear view across a small field below once the sun lifted the mist. We always sat on a pair of old stumps near the edge, waiting for legal shooting light. The air was barely above freezing, carrying the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. We had arrived in the deep night, navigating the winding highway and then the rough Forest Service road. The truck's headlights cut through the heavy fog, illuminating the dense wall of trees. The gravel crunched under the tires, a familiar sound in the isolation. We parked near a small, abandoned cabin, its windows dark and empty. The hum of the engine was the only sound for a few moments after we shut it off. We gathered our gear, moving quietly in the cold air. The fog was already thick, clinging to the branches and making the forest feel even more enclosed. We walked the short trail to the logging deck, our boots rustling through the fallen leaves. The silence of the night was profound, broken only by the drip of moisture from the log ends stacked nearby. We settled onto our stumps, facing the field, our rifles resting across our laps. The pre-dawn light was a faint, diffused gray, struggling to penetrate the dense fog. We sat in comfortable silence, occasionally exchanging a quiet whisper about the conditions. The fog was exceptionally heavy that morning, reducing visibility to perhaps 50 yards. I could hear the steady drip from the stacked logs, a rhythmic sound in the stillness. The cold seeped into my gear, but I was dressed for it. Mark and I had been hunting together for years, and we understood the unspoken protocols of the pre-dawn wait. We scanned the obscured field and the tree line, relying on sound more than sight. The air was still, without even a breath of wind to stir the mist. We had checked our blaze orange protocols before leaving the truck, ensuring we were visible to each other if we moved. The logging landing itself was a relatively flat, open area, perhaps an acre in size, surrounded by the steep hardwood forest. The stacked logs formed a rough wall along one side, remnants of a previous season's work. These were mostly oak and maple, their bark still rough and dark. As the light began to improve, a subtle shift occurred in the fog. It didn't lift immediately, but rather thinned in certain areas, creating pockets of slightly clearer air. I was looking towards the far end of the logging deck, where the stacked logs rose about 10 feet high. The mist swirled around them, making their outlines indistinct. Then I saw it. Standing between two of the larger log piles, perhaps 50 yards away, was a shape. It was dark, darker than the surrounding fog, and appeared to be human-sized. The figure was perfectly still, a vertical shadow against the diffused gray. I nudged Mark with my elbow, not speaking, just indicating with my head. He followed my gaze. His body tensed slightly, a subtle shift I recognized. The shape was indistinct, a contour-hugging shade, but its posture was unmistakably upright. It seemed to be facing away from us, towards the deeper forest beyond the landing. The fog played tricks on the eyes, making it difficult to discern any specific features. There was no movement, no shift in its stance. It was simply there, a static presence in the swirling mist. I tried to focus, to make sense of what I was seeing. Was it a stump? A piece of logging equipment? But the proportions felt wrong for either. It was too slender, too regular in its verticality. The silence was absolute, broken only by the persistent drip of moisture. I felt a cold prickle on my skin, unrelated to the ambient temperature. Mark raised his binoculars slowly, carefully. I watched his face as he peered through the lenses. He lowered them after a few moments, his expression unreadable. He looked at me, then back at the figure. "You see that?" he whispered, his voice low and steady. I nodded, my own voice caught in my throat. We both continued to stare, trying to resolve the ambiguity. The figure remained motionless, a dark silhouette. It was positioned deep within the log stacks, almost as if it had stepped into a narrow gap between them. The fog seemed to cling to it, emphasizing its dark outline. There was no color, just a deeper shade of gray within the overall whiteness. The air felt sharper around us, despite the lack of wind. We had encountered other hunters before, but never one who stood so perfectly still, so silently, in such an exposed position. There was no blaze orange visible, no backpack, no rifle. It was just a dark, featureless form. The minutes stretched out, feeling much longer than they were. The light continued to improve, slowly brightening the scene. The fog began to thin more noticeably, particularly closer to us. I could feel my heart beating a little faster, a quiet hum in my chest. We exchanged another glance, a silent question passing between us. Neither of us had an explanation. The figure remained, an unmoving sentinel. The details of the log stacks themselves were becoming clearer now. the rough texture of the bark, the cut ends. But the figure remained a dark, smooth void. It was an absence of detail, rather than a presence of it. The fog was still thick enough to prevent any clear identification, but it was no longer a complete whiteout. We could see the individual logs, their varying lengths and diameters. The figure was still there, a dark, vertical line. It was not a tree, nor a shadow cast by the rising sun, as the sun was still too low and the fog too dense for distinct shadows. It was a solid, dark shape. Then, as the fog thinned further, almost imperceptibly, the figure was gone. One moment it was there, the next it was not. There was no movement, no blur, no sound of footsteps. It simply ceased to be visible. The space between the log stacks was empty, filled only with the swirling mist. We both blinked, then looked at each other. Mark slowly raised his binoculars again, sweeping the area where the figure had been. He lowered them, shaking his head slightly. The light was now strong enough to reveal the individual straps and chains used to secure the log piles. There was nothing, just the rough bark and the damp air. The fog continued its slow retreat, revealing more of the logging deck and the surrounding forest. The field below was still partially obscured, but the area around the log stacks was becoming clear. We scanned the ground, looking for any sign, any disturbance in the wet leaves or mud. There was nothing. The silence returned, but it felt different now, heavier. We stayed on our stumps for a few more minutes, watching the area intently. The fog continued to dissipate, revealing the full extent of the logging deck. The space between the log piles was now completely visible. There was absolutely nothing there. No person, no equipment, no natural formation that could have mimicked the shape we had seen. The ground was undisturbed. We slowly rose from our stumps, our movements deliberate. Mark kept his rifle at the ready, though neither of us expected to see anything again. We walked cautiously towards the log stacks, approaching the spot where the figure had stood. The air was still cold, but the sun was beginning to break through the remaining wisps of fog, casting long, weak shadows. We examined the ground between the logs. The soil was damp, a mix of mud and leaf litter. There were no footprints, no broken twigs, no sign of anything having been there. The logs themselves were rough and solid. We ran our hands over the bark, feeling the cold, damp texture. There was no hidden recess, no way for a person to have simply vanished. The space was too narrow for a quick, silent retreat without leaving a trace. We walked around the entire perimeter of the log stacks, checking every angle. Nothing. The forest beyond was dense, a tangle of bare branches and undergrowth. We scanned the tree line, but saw only the familiar shapes of the hardwood trees. The isolation of the logging deck felt more pronounced now. Mark pulled out his phone, checking the compass and taking a few photographs of the empty space. The images showed only the stacked logs in the thinning fog. There was no evidence of what we had seen. We spoke in low tones, recounting our observations to each other, trying to find a logical explanation. We considered every possibility. Another hunter, a piece of equipment, an optical illusion caused by the fog. But none of them fit the complete disappearance without a trace. The stillness, the lack of any sound, the perfect immobility of the figure. It defied a simple explanation. We spent another hour thoroughly searching the immediate area, checking the game trails leading into the woods. We found nothing out of the ordinary. The forest was quiet. The only sounds the rustle of leaves and the occasional bird call. We eventually returned to our truck, the incident weighing heavily on us, The drive back along the gravel road was mostly silent. We stopped at a small diner for coffee, trying to process what had happened. We discussed filing a report with local authorities, but what would we say? We saw a dark shape in the fog that vanished. There was no evidence, no crime, no clear threat. It would sound like a fabrication. We decided against it, knowing how such an account would be received. We had no physical evidence, no photograph of the figure itself, only the empty space where it had been. The experience remained a shared, unspoken understanding between us. I still think about that morning often. The image of that dark, still shape between the stacked logs in the fog remains clear in my memory. The way it simply ceased to be, without movement or sound, is what truly stays with me. The quiet dread of that moment, the absolute silence, sometimes returns in the deep night. If you enjoyed this story, hit subscribe. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and which moment hit you the hardest. I always check. I was still hunting a familiar ridge break in the Appalachians. It was early autumn, just before dawn, with a thick, cold fog settling into the hollows. I noticed a subtle movement ahead, a flicker of something that did not belong. My routine began well before first light. I parked my truck on a gravel logging landing, the headlights cutting weak beams through the pre-dawn mist. The air was barely above freezing, carrying the damp scent of decaying leaves and wet earth. I checked my gear one last time, rifle unloaded, blaze orange vest secured, GPS unit powered on, and a topo map folded into my chest pocket. I moved slowly, deliberately, along a well-worn game trail that followed the contour of the ridge. My breath plumed in the cold air, a quiet rhythm against the crunch of frost-covered leaves under my boots. This particular section of the ridge was known for its mature hardwoods, transitioning into younger regrowth further down the slope. I had hunted this area for several seasons, familiar with every dip and rise, every cluster of pines. The isolation was usually a comfort, a predictable solitude. The fog was denser than forecast, clinging to the terrain, obscuring visibility beyond a few dozen yards. It was a contour-hugging mist, thickest in the low spots and along the breaks. I kept my pace slow, a deliberate step-by-step advance, pausing often to listen and scan the limited sight lines. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional drip of moisture from overhead branches. My senses were heightened, attuned to the subtle shifts in the environment. I focused on the trail ahead, watching for any sign of movement, any break in the uniform grayness. The cold seeped into my layers, a constant presence, but my movements generated enough warmth to keep it at bay. I knew the trail would soon cut through a section of denser underbrush, a place where the fog often thickened further. It was as I approached this transition point that I saw it again. A shape, indistinct at first, seemed to step out from the fog just ahead, perhaps 50 yards distant. It was roughly human-sized, with a broad, solid build. The outline was dark against the lighter gray of the mist, but I could not discern any specific features. My first thought was another hunter, despite the early hour and the remote location. I stopped, raising my hand slightly, a standard gesture to indicate my presence. The shape did not react. It simply stood there for a moment, then seemed to fold back into the swirling vapor. I waited, listening intently. There was no sound of footsteps, no rustle of clothing, nothing to indicate another person moving through the undergrowth. The silence returned, absolute and unbroken. I continued forward, more cautiously now, my rifle still slung, but my hand resting near the grip. The trail narrowed, winding around a cluster of thick rhododendrons. The fog here was almost opaque, reducing visibility to less than 20 yards. I moved with exaggerated care, placing each foot deliberately to avoid making unnecessary noise. My eyes strained, trying to penetrate the shifting curtain of mist. Then, as I rounded a gentle bend, it appeared again. This time, it was closer, perhaps 30 yards ahead. The outline was clearer, unmistakably human. It wore what appeared to be a cap, and its shoulders seemed broad, similar to my own build. The most unsettling detail was the color. A dull, muted orange, like a blaze vest, seemed to cling to its upper torso. It was the same shade as my own vest. The figure was moving, slowly, deliberately, mirroring my own still hunting pace. It took a step, then paused, just as I would. It seemed to follow the exact line of the game trail. I froze, my breath held, watching it. There was no sound, no indication of its presence beyond the visual. It was like watching a silent film. The fog swirled around it, sometimes obscuring parts of its form, then revealing them again. I tried to call out, but the words caught in my throat. A primal instinct told me not to make a sound. The figure took another step, then another, moving deeper into the thickest part of the fog. It seemed to melt into the mist, disappearing as completely as if it had never been there. I stood for a long moment, the cold seeping deeper into my bones, a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. A trick of the light, a patch of fog, a tree stump. But the movement was too fluid, too deliberate, too human-like. And the blaze orange color was too specific. I checked my GPS unit, confirming my exact location on the ridge break. I was precisely where I expected to be. There were no other trails intersecting this one for a considerable distance. I scanned the ground for tracks, but the frost-covered leaves and damp earth showed no disturbance beyond my own boot prints. The silence was oppressive, amplifying the thumping of my own heart. I considered turning back, but the thought of retracing my steps, potentially encountering the figure again from behind, felt worse. I decided to continue, maintaining a greater distance, keeping the figure within my peripheral vision if it reappeared. I advanced slowly, my senses on high alert. The air grew colder, and the fog seemed to thicken with each step. The hardwoods gave way to younger, denser growth, the kind that held moisture and muffled sound. The trail became less defined here, more of a deer path than a human one. I kept my eyes fixed ahead, trying to anticipate where the figure might emerge next. After a few minutes, it reappeared. This time, it was slightly to my left, off the main trail, moving through the dense underbrush parallel to my path. It was still the same build, the same muted blaze orange, the same cap. It moved with an unnatural smoothness, gliding rather than stepping, making no sound whatsoever. I could not see its face, only the vague outline of a head. It was always just at the edge of my visibility, always partially obscured by the shifting fog. A profound sense of isolation settled over me. I was alone on this ridge, yet I was not. The presence was undeniable, a silent, mirroring shadow. I reached for my radio, a small handheld unit I carried for emergencies. I clicked it on, the faint hum of static, a welcome sound in the oppressive quiet. I did not transmit, just held it, the weight of it a small comfort. The figure continued its parallel movement, always maintaining the same distance, always just ahead. It would appear for a few seconds, then fold back into the mist, only to reappear moments later. It was like a reflection, but one that moved independently, always just out of reach, always just beyond clear sight. The cold intensified, a deep, penetrating chill that seemed to emanate from the fog itself. I felt a growing unease, a deep-seated dread that went beyond simple fear. This was not another hunter. This was something else. I checked my topo map again, cross-referencing it with the GPS. I was approaching a steep drop-off, a natural break in the ridgeline. The trail would become treacherous there, winding down into a deep hollow. I knew this area well, and it was not a place I wanted to be in thick fog with an unknown entity shadowing me. I made a decision to alter my course, to cut sharply to the right, away from the ridge break and down a gentler slope that led to a wider logging road. This would take me off my planned route, but it felt safer than continuing along the path the figure seemed to be leading me on. As I began to turn, the figure stopped. It turned its head slightly, or at least the outline of its head seemed to shift, as if observing my change in direction. It remained motionless for a long moment, a silent sentinel in the swirling fog. Then, slowly, deliberately, it folded back into the mist, disappearing completely. I did not see it again. I moved quickly then, not running, but maintaining a brisk, steady pace down the slope. The crunch of leaves under my boots was loud in my ears. I kept the radio on, listening to the static, a constant reminder of the possibility of contact. I did not look back. I focused on the terrain, navigating by instinct in the faint outline of the logging road I knew lay below. The fog began to thin as I descended, breaking into wisps and patches. Eventually, I reached the logging road, a wide gravel path that offered clear visibility for a considerable distance. The sense of relief was profound, a physical release of tension that had been building for what felt like hours. I walked the road back to my truck, the sound of my own footsteps a welcome, normal noise. Back at the truck, I checked my track log on the GPS. The path I had taken was clear, a deviation from my usual route. There was nothing on the log to indicate another presence, no unusual markers. I drove back to my cabin, the headlights cutting through the lingering fog on the highway. Later that day, I debriefed with a mentor hunter, a man with decades of experience in these woods. I described what I had seen, the silent movement, the mirroring shape, the blaze orange. He listened patiently, offering no easy explanations. We reviewed my hand-drawn cross-section of the ridge, comparing it to the topo map. There was no logical reason for another hunter to be in that specific location at that hour, moving in that manner. We found no evidence of anyone else in the area. The incident was noted, a strange entry in my mental logbook. I still hunt that ridge, but I approach that specific section with a different kind of awareness. The fog, especially in autumn, holds a new quality for me now. I scan the mist with a heightened sense of vigilance, always looking for that particular outline, that muted blaze orange. The memory of that silent, mirroring figure remains, a quiet whisper in the back of my mind. I sometimes wonder what it was, or if it was anything at all. The isolation of the forest can play tricks on the mind, but the clarity of that image, the deliberate movement, still feels too real to dismiss. I was glassing a frost hollow from the opposite ridgeline, checking for movement. It was early autumn, just before dawn, and the air held a sharp, cold dampness. A brief flash of orange caught my eye, deep within the patchy fog that clung to the lower slopes. My position offered a clear view across the hollow, a distance of about 3/4 of a mile. The club's main cabin was a few miles back, nestled near the gravel access road. I had been in place for about an hour, watching the mist breathe along the contours of the terrain. The orange was a quick, bright flare, distinct against the muted grays and browns of the leaf-off forest. It appeared at the edge of a dense stand of hemlocks, where the fog was thickest. My binoculars brought the area into sharper focus, but the color was gone as quickly as it had appeared. I scanned the spot repeatedly, but the fog had already shifted, obscuring the exact location. The hunt club operated with strict safety protocols, especially during the early rifle season. Every member signed in at the main cabin, indicating their intended hunting zone on a large, laminated map board. We marked our positions with small, numbered pins. This system ensured everyone knew where others were located, preventing accidents and allowing for quick accountability. Blaze orange was mandatory, a non-negotiable requirement for visibility. It was a simple, effective system designed for the rugged Appalachian terrain, where visibility could change in moments. Before heading out, I had reviewed the check-in board. There were about 3 other members signed in for the morning hunt. Their pins were placed on the map, indicating positions on distant ridges or along the old logging trails. None of them were anywhere near the hollow I was observing. The fog was a known variable in this region, often settling into low-lying areas during the cold autumn mornings. It could lift quickly or linger for hours, creating unpredictable sightlines. We were all trained to account for it, to understand its effect on range and visibility. The hum of the cabin's generator was a distant, low thrum as I left, a sound that faded quickly once I was on the trail. I lowered the binoculars, then raised them again, focusing on the spot where the orange had been. The fog was a living thing, a slow, silent current moving through the hollow. It swirled, thinned, and then thickened again, revealing glimpses of the tree line before swallowing them once more. The air was still, barely above freezing, and the frost on the fallen leaves crunched faintly under my boots when I shifted my weight. I zipped my jacket higher, the sound a small rasp in the quiet morning. The orange had been a pure, vibrant shade, unmistakable as blaze material. It was not the duller hue of a distant rock face or the reddish-brown of a specific tree bark. It was the specific, high-visibility color mandated by safety regulations. I waited, holding the binoculars steady, my breath pluming in the cold air. A few minutes passed, then a few more. The fog continued its slow dance, obscuring and revealing the same section of the hollow. I saw nothing. No movement, no further flash of color. The silence was absolute, broken only by the occasional rustle of a squirrel in the dry leaves. I considered the possibility of a non-member, someone hunting without permission. This was rare, but it happened. However, even a poacher would likely wear some form of camouflage, not blaze orange. The color was too specific, too indicative of a hunter following protocol, yet not following the club's check-in protocol. The thought was unsettling. I scanned the entire hollow, moving the binoculars slowly, methodically, across the entire visible expanse. The sun was beginning to lighten the eastern sky, casting a pale, diffused glow through the mist. The light did not penetrate the hollow deeply, leaving it in a perpetual twilight. The orange reappeared. It was in the exact same spot, a small, static patch of color, almost perfectly rectangular, nestled against the dark trunks of the hemlocks. It was not moving. It was not waving. It was simply there, a flat, two-dimensional presence. I held my breath, watching it. It remained visible for what felt like a long minute, perhaps a little more. Then, as the fog shifted again, a thicker bank rolling in from the lower creek bed, it was gone. The image was burned into my mind, a small, bright rectangle of orange, perfectly still, in a place where no one should have been. I checked my watch. It was still early, but the incident had disrupted my hunt. The unease was growing. I knew the hollow well. It was a natural funnel for game, but also a difficult area to navigate, especially in the fog. There were no established trails through that specific section of hemlocks, only dense undergrowth and fallen timber. A hunter would have to be deliberately positioned there, or lost. Neither scenario fit the static, unmoving appearance of the orange. It was too precise, too isolated. I decided to return to the cabin. The gravel trail crunched under my boots as I walked, the sound amplified in the quiet forest. The cold air felt sharper now, carrying a hint of the coming winter. I kept my radio clipped to my pack, but I hesitated to call in the sighting immediately. I wanted to verify the check-in board first. There was always a chance I had misread something, or that a late arrival had signed in after I left. The logical explanation was always the first one to pursue. Upon reaching the cabin, the headlights of my truck cut through the lingering morning gloom. I parked and went inside. The main room was empty, the air still cool despite the wood stove glowing faintly. I walked directly to the check-in board. I carefully reviewed the names and the corresponding pin locations on the map. I double-checked each pin against the written logbook entries. There were 3 other members signed in, just as I remembered. Their positions were clearly marked, far from the hollow. One was on the north ridge, another near the old logging landing, and the third was several miles east, close to the highway. None of them were in the area where I had seen the orange. I pulled out the club's 2-way radio, a sturdy unit that connected us to a central dispatch point, manned by a rotating schedule of members. I keyed the microphone. Cabin to dispatch, this is my name. Over. A moment of static. Then a calm voice responded. Dispatch, go ahead, my name. Over. I explained what I had seen, keeping my voice even and factual. I described the location, the color, the static nature of the sighting, and the fact that no one was logged in for that area. Dispatch confirmed my assessment. Understood, my name. No one is logged in for that hollow. We'll initiate a check with the other members. Stand by for instructions. Over. I waited, the radio humming softly. A few minutes later, dispatch came back. All logged members have confirmed their positions. No one is in the hollow. We are contacting the game warden's office. Do not approach the area alone. We will send a small team to investigate. Stay at the cabin. Over. The instruction not to approach alone was standard procedure for any unaccounted-for presence. It was a safety measure, designed to prevent a single individual from encountering a potentially dangerous situation. I waited, watching the light slowly brighten outside the cabin windows. The sun was now fully above the horizon, but the hollow would still be shrouded in mist. About an hour later, a truck pulled up. It was the club president, along with another member and a game warden. They carried radios, maps, and a first aid kit. I briefed them, pointing out the exact location on the map. The game warden listened intently, making notes in a small logbook. He asked precise questions about the color, the duration, and the surrounding terrain. We then drove to the nearest access point, a rough trail that led down into the hollow. The air grew colder as we descended, the fog becoming thicker, more pervasive. The forest was silent, the usual morning sounds of birds muted by the heavy mist. We moved slowly, the game warden leading, his rifle held ready. The ground was soft with damp leaves, making it difficult to find any clear tracks. We reached the hemlock stand, the air here heavy and still. The fog swirled around us, reducing visibility to only a few yards. We spread out, maintaining visual contact, searching the area where I had seen the orange. We found nothing. No footprints, no disturbed leaves, no discarded items, no sign of a camp. The ground was untouched. The trees were bare, their lower branches shrouded in mist. We spent about 2 hours systematically searching the area. The game warden used a handheld GPS to mark our search pattern, ensuring we covered every square yard. The isolation of the place was palpable. The only sounds were our own footsteps and the occasional crackle of the radio. The cold seeped into my bones. We found no evidence, no explanation. It was as if the orange patch had simply materialized and then vanished without a trace. The game warden took a few photographs of the undisturbed ground, though he admitted they would likely show nothing. The official report noted an unconfirmed visual sighting of an unidentified blaze-orange object. It was filed as an anomaly, with no further action recommended due to the complete lack of physical evidence. A safety meeting was held a few weeks later, where the incident was discussed. The club reinforced its check-in procedures and reminded members of the importance of reporting anything unusual. There was no consensus on what I had seen. Some suggested a trick of the light, others a piece of discarded material caught on a branch, though I knew the color was too vibrant and too perfectly shaped for that. The incident remained an open question, a quiet footnote in the club's logbook. I still hunt that area, but I approach the hollow with a different kind of awareness. The memory of that static, bright orange patch, perfectly still against the dark trees and shifting fog, stays with me. It was a presence that defied explanation, a silent observation that left no trace. I still scan that hemlock stand, especially when the fog rolls in, half expecting to see it again. I am a hunter, and I was positioned in a frost hollow, watching a game trail. It was just before first light in late autumn, the air barely above freezing. A dense pocket of fog had settled between two large oak trees, obscuring the hollow floor. My routine on these trips is precise, honed over many seasons in the Appalachian woods. I had hiked in the previous afternoon, setting up a small, camouflaged blind well before dusk. The location was chosen for its natural funneling effect, a shallow creek bed running through a narrow hollow flanked by mature hardwoods. Deer often use this route to move between bedding areas and feeding grounds. My gear was checked, my rifle sighted, and my position offered a clear view of the trail for about 50 yards in either direction. I had a thermos of coffee, a few energy bars, and a small logbook for observations. The quiet of the forest at night is a familiar comfort, broken only by the rustle of leaves or the distant hoot of an owl. I arrived at my spot a few hours before dawn, navigating by the faint glow of a headlamp set to its lowest red light setting. The gravel path leading to the logging landing crunched under my boots, a sound that quickly faded as I moved onto the softer forest floor. The air was still, holding the chill of the night. I settled into my blind, arranging my equipment methodically. My rifle rested on its bipod, aimed down the trail. I checked my watch, noting the time in my logbook. The sky was a deep, starless black, indicating heavy cloud cover. There was no wind, only the pervasive cold that seeped into the ground. I pulled my insulated layers tighter, waiting for the first hint of light. As the pre-dawn hours passed, a thick fog began to form, pooling in the lowest parts of the hollow. It was a contour-hugging mist, dense and white, rising slowly from the creek bed. The temperature had dropped further, and I could hear the faint drip of thawing frost from the branches above. The fog was particularly heavy around a pair of ancient oak trees that stood close together, their bare branches reaching like skeletal arms into the gloom. These trees marked a natural choke point on the trail, a spot I always paid close attention to. The visibility quickly dropped to just a few yards, making any movement beyond that point impossible to discern. I adjusted my position, relying on sound and the faint outlines of the nearest trees. The first hint of light arrived as a subtle graying of the sky above the ridgeline. The fog, however, remained stubbornly thick in the hollow. I could just make out the trunks of the twin oaks, their lower sections swallowed by the mist. It was then that I noticed it. Between the two oak trunks, where the fog was densest, there was a shape. It was upright, dark, and appeared to be standing perfectly still. My first thought was another hunter, perhaps moving into position or pausing to survey the area. This was unusual, as I had not heard any approach, and the area was known to be quiet. I raised my binoculars, focusing on the spot. The fog distorted the view, making it difficult to get a clear image. The shape remained static, a dark, vertical mass against the swirling white. It was roughly the height and width of a person, perhaps a little taller, but the edges were indistinct, softened by the mist. There was no movement, no shift in weight, no turning of a head. It simply stood there, perfectly still, like a silhouette cut from black paper and placed within the fog. I lowered the binoculars, then raised them again, trying to confirm what I was seeing. The shape persisted. A quiet dread began to settle. I checked my watch again. It had been there for what felt like a long time, perhaps 20 minutes, maybe more. The light was slowly improving, but the fog pocket between the oaks seemed to resist the dawn. I scanned the surrounding area, looking for any other sign of movement, any indication of an animal or another person. There was nothing. The forest remained silent, save for the drip of water and the faint gurgle of the creek. The stillness of the figure was unsettling. It did not behave like a person waiting, nor like an animal. It was simply present. I kept my rifle trained on the general area, not directly on the figure, but ready. My finger rested on the safety. My mind cycled through possibilities, a tree stump, a trick of the light, a discarded piece of equipment. But the shape was too regular, too upright, too much like a human form. It did not waver or shift. It was a solid, dark presence in the heart of the fog. I tried to discern any features, any clothing, but the mist was too thick. It was a featureless, dark column. The air felt colder around me, despite the rising sun. I continued to observe the figure for what felt like an eternity. The sun was now fully above the ridge, casting a pale, diffused light through the fog. Still, the shape stood. There was no sound from it, no rustle, no breath. It was utterly silent. I considered calling out, but something held me back. The silence felt too profound, the stillness too absolute. It felt wrong to break it. My hands were steady, but a cold knot had formed in my stomach. This was not a normal encounter in the woods. This was something else. Then, without warning, a sudden gust of wind swept through the hollow. It was a sharp, cold breath that tore through the fog. In moments, the dense white curtain between the two oaks was ripped away, dissipated into thin tendrils that vanished up the hillside. The hollow floor was suddenly clear. The twin oaks stood stark and bare. The space between them was empty. The figure was gone. There was nothing there. No stump, no discarded gear, no trace of anything that could have formed that shape. The ground was covered in a thin layer of damp leaves and exposed earth. My breath hitched. I lowered my binoculars, then raised them again, scanning the now clear area. Nothing. The space was utterly vacant. I checked my watch. The entire incident had lasted for nearly an hour. The sudden emptiness was more jarring than the presence itself. I remained in my blind for a few more minutes, trying to process what I had just witnessed. My hands were still steady, but a tremor ran through my core. I carefully lowered my rifle and began to pack my gear, moving slowly, deliberately. I decided to investigate the spot. My approach was cautious, methodical. I kept my eyes on the ground, looking for any tracks, any disturbance in the damp leaves or soft earth. I moved slowly towards the twin oaks, my senses heightened. The air was still cold, but the sun was now breaking through the remaining wisps of fog, casting long shadows. I reached the spot where the figure had stood. There was nothing. The ground was undisturbed. No footprints, no broken twigs, no flattened leaves. It was as if nothing had ever been there. I took out my phone and captured a series of photographs of the empty space between the oaks, then a wider shot of the hollow. The images would serve as a record, though they showed only an ordinary forest scene. I consulted my handwritten range notes, comparing them to the now clear visibility. The notes confirmed the dense fog pocket. I made an entry in my logbook, detailing the observation. Upright, dark, static form in fog pocket between twin oaks. Disappeared with wind gust. No trace found. I kept the language factual, devoid of interpretation. I spent another hour meticulously searching the immediate vicinity, expanding my search pattern in a wide circle around the oaks. I checked behind fallen logs, under dense rhododendron thickets, and along the creek bed. I was looking for anything that could explain the visual anomaly. A discarded tarp, a natural rock formation, a burnt tree trunk. There was nothing. The forest floor was typical Appalachian terrain, damp and covered in leaf litter, with no unusual features. The silence felt heavier now, no longer comforting, but watchful. I packed up my blind and began the hike out, moving with a heightened sense of awareness. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, made me pause. The isolation of the forest, usually a source of peace, now felt like a vast, empty space where things could simply appear and disappear. I reached the gravel logging road and followed it back to my truck. The hum of the highway in the distance was a welcome sound, a reminder of the world beyond the hollow. Back at my cabin, I reviewed my logbook entries and the photographs. The images were unremarkable, showing only the trees and the forest floor. There was no evidence of what I had seen. I considered filing a report with the local game warden. But what would I say? That I saw a person-shaped mass in the fog that vanished? Without any physical evidence, it would sound like a hallucination. I decided against it, keeping the incident to myself. The cold dread remained, a quiet residue of the morning. The memory of that static figure, standing silently in the fog pocket, has never left me. I still return to those woods, but I avoid that particular hollow. Sometimes, when the fog rolls in, I find myself scanning the tree lines, half expecting to see it again. The quiet dread of that morning remains. I was in my tree stand, settled before dawn, watching a field corner in the Appalachian foothills. A thick band of fog had rolled in overnight, clinging to the lower elevations and obscuring the usual sight lines. Something in the drifting mist, far across the field, caught my attention. My routine for hunting in this region was always precise, especially during the autumn leaf-off season. I had arrived well before first light, parking my truck a good distance from the logging road and walking in along a familiar game trail. The air was barely above freezing, carrying the damp scent of decaying leaves and wet earth. I had climbed into my stand, secured my harness, and arranged my gear with practiced movements, ensuring everything was within easy reach. The pre-dawn quiet was profound, broken only by the occasional rustle of unseen small animals in the undergrowth or the distant, almost imperceptible hum of the highway. I always carried a topographical map, a compass, and a handheld radio, even when hunting alone. Visibility charts were something I studied, understanding how different atmospheric conditions could play tricks on perception. The fog that morning was particularly dense in the low-lying areas, creating shifting, indistinct shapes along the tree line. My blaze-orange vest was a standard safety measure, a bright contrast against the muted greens and browns of the forest. I had set up in a familiar spot, overlooking a small clearing where a brush clump offered cover for game moving between two ridge breaks. This particular stand provided a good vantage point, elevated above the immediate ground fog. The first hint of light was just beginning to filter through the heavy cloud cover, painting the sky in dull grays. The fog below me was a living thing, swirling and thinning in places, then thickening again. I had been scanning the field for perhaps an hour, my binoculars sweeping slowly across the distant tree line. That was when I saw it. A dark, upright shape, partially obscured by a particularly dense band of mist. It appeared to be standing still, positioned near a cluster of young pines at the far edge of the field. The distance was considerable, perhaps a few hundred yards. My initial impression was of a person, or at least something with a similar vertical dimension. The shape was indistinct, a dark column against the lighter gray of the fog. It seemed to possess a certain stillness, a deliberate lack of movement that felt unnatural for an animal. I lowered my binoculars, blinking, and then raised them again, trying to resolve the image. The fog shifted, momentarily revealing a clearer outline, then closing in again. The shape remained, unwavering, a silent sentinel in the mist. My training and years of experience told me not to trust a first glance in such conditions. Misidentification was a serious risk, one that could have severe consequences. I reached for my rangefinder, a small, compact device that fit comfortably in my palm. I brought the rangefinder to my eye, aligning the reticle with the dark shape. The device emitted a soft, almost inaudible click as I pressed the button. A laser beam shot out, invisible to the naked eye, designed to bounce off the target and return, calculating the precise distance. The digital display flickered, then settled on a reading. It was a clear, unambiguous number, indicating a distance of just over 200 yards. This confirmed the object was indeed far across the field, at the edge of the fog band. However, the reading also provided an elevation. The rangefinder indicated the target was barely above my waist height. I re-aimed, carefully sweeping the reticle up and down the perceived shape. Each reading returned a similar low elevation. This was the first true irregularity. A standing person would register a much greater height, certainly well above my waist from that distance and angle. I held the device steady, trying to reconcile the visual impression of a tall, upright figure with the precise, low elevation reading. The fog continued its slow, deliberate drift, occasionally obscuring the shape entirely, then revealing it again. Each time it reappeared, my mind still tried to interpret it as something tall. I spent several minutes repeating the process, ranging the object from different points within my field of view. Each time, the rangefinder consistently reported a low profile. The shape itself remained stubbornly ambiguous to my eye, a dark, vertical mass that seemed to defy the instrument's data. It was a conflict between what I thought I saw and what the technology was telling me. The cold air felt sharper, and a faint whisper of wind moved through the bare branches around me. I knew I could not proceed with any action based on a visual that was so clearly contradicted by a reliable device. My procedural training emphasized verification, especially when visibility was compromised. I decided to descend from the stand and approach the area on foot. This was a slow, deliberate process. I unclipped my harness, carefully lowered my rifle, and then began my descent. Each step on the metal rungs quiet and controlled. Once on the ground, the fog felt thicker, colder. It swirled around my knees, obscuring the ground cover. I consulted my topographical map, orienting myself to the field corner and the distant cluster of pines. My plan was to circle wide, staying downwind, and approach the location of the perceived figure from a different angle. I wanted to confirm the nature of the object without putting myself in an unknown situation. I moved slowly, placing each foot carefully to avoid snapping twigs or rustling leaves. The forest floor was damp, the fallen leaves softened by the moisture, which helped to muffle my steps. I kept my eyes fixed on the general direction of the object, though it was now completely swallowed by the fog. The isolation of the forest pressed in, the silence broken only by the soft crunch of my boots on the gravel of the old logging trail I followed. I checked my compass frequently, ensuring I maintained my bearing. The cold seeped into my clothes, a constant, dull ache. After perhaps 20 minutes of careful movement, I reached the edge of the field, closer to where the shape had been. The fog here was still dense, but it was beginning to show signs of thinning as the sun climbed higher, though still hidden by the heavy cloud cover. I could now make out the individual pines, their dark needles glistening with moisture. I moved cautiously, my senses heightened, listening for any sound, any movement. There was nothing but the drip of moisture from the branches and the faint, distant hum of the highway. Then, through a momentary thinning of the mist, I saw it clearly. The dark, upright shape was indeed there, exactly where I had ranged it. It was a cut tree stump, roughly 1.5 feet in diameter, standing perhaps 2.5 feet tall. Its top was flat, covered in a thin layer of frost, and its bark was dark and rough. The illusion had been complete. The contour-hugging fog, combined with the low light in the distance, had created the perfect conditions for misperception. My mind had filled in the blanks, projecting a human-like form onto an inanimate object. I walked directly to the stump, touching its rough surface. It was solid, unmoving, exactly as the rangefinder had indicated. The relief was immediate, a quiet exhalation of tension I hadn't realized I was holding. I took out my phone and captured a photograph of the stump, then made a quick sketch in my logbook, noting the date, time, and conditions. I also marked its position on my topographical map. This documentation was part of my personal safety protocol, a way to record unusual observations and learn from them. The incident served as a stark reminder of how easily perception could be distorted in challenging environments. I spent a few more minutes in the area, examining the stump and its surroundings. There were no tracks, no signs of recent activity beyond the usual forest inhabitants. The fog continued to lift, slowly revealing more of the field and the distant tree line. The dark shape, now clearly a stump, no longer held any mystery. The initial sense of unease had dissipated, replaced by a quiet satisfaction in having followed proper procedure and verified the anomaly. I then made my way back to my stand, the morning hunt continuing, though with a renewed appreciation for caution. I still review that photograph sometimes, the image of the stump in the fading mist. It serves as a constant reminder of how easily the mind can create a figure where none exists. The quiet dread of that morning, the sense of something standing out there, remains a vivid memory. I was driving my pickup truck, heading out for an early deer hunt. It was a cold, clear autumn morning, still dark, with patches of ground fog clinging to the hollows. The air felt sharper than usual, carrying the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. I had been hunting this particular section of the Appalachian foothills for many years. My routine was well established. I would leave the cabin before light, navigating the narrow, winding gravel roads that snaked along the ridgelines. The truck was a familiar extension of myself, its engine note a steady hum against the pre-dawn quiet. I knew every dip and rise, every loose patch of gravel, every sharp curve. This morning was no different, or so I thought. The truck's headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the immediate stretch of road ahead. My focus was on the drive, on reaching my preferred stand before the first hint of dawn broke over the eastern ridge. The isolation of these moments was usually a comfort, a quiet preparation for the day's hunt. My destination was a logging landing about 3 miles further along the ridge. From there, I would hike a familiar game trail down into a hardwood bottom. The air temperature was barely above freezing, and a thin layer of frost coated the truck's windshield, requiring the wipers to work intermittently. The defroster was on full blast, pushing warm air against the glass. The forest on either side of the road was dense, a mix of oak and maple, now mostly bare of leaves. This leaf-off condition meant visibility into the woods was much greater than during the summer months. I was moving at a cautious speed, perhaps 15 miles per hour, given the curves and the potential for deer to cross the road. The truck's suspension absorbed the bumps and ruts of the unpaved surface. The fog was not uniform. It lay in distinct bands, thicker in the low-lying areas and thinner on the exposed ridgetops. As I rounded a particularly tight bend, the headlights swept across a steep, open slope to my left. This section of the hill was known as the leaf-off slope among local hunters because of its sparse undergrowth and the way the trees shed their leaves early, offering clear sight lines. The slope dropped away sharply, perhaps 100 feet or more, before leveling out into a small, flat bench. My high beams were engaged, pushing light deep into the forest. It was in that moment, as the truck's lights illuminated the slope, that I saw them. A line of figures, standing upright, perhaps a dozen or more, positioned about halfway down the incline. They were spaced irregularly, some closer together, some further apart, but all facing generally in the same direction, away from the road and deeper into the woods. They appeared dark against the lighter, frost-dusted ground. My immediate thought was that they were other hunters, perhaps a large group moving into position. This was unusual for this area, especially so early, but not entirely impossible. I slowed the truck further, my foot easing off the accelerator. The figures were still. They did not move, did not turn their heads toward the approaching lights. They seemed to be simply standing, waiting. Their forms were indistinct, blurred slightly by the distance and the lingering tendrils of fog that wove through the trees. I could not discern any details of clothing or equipment. They were just dark, vertical shapes, too numerous to be a small hunting party. The scene held for only a few seconds as the truck continued its slow progress around the curve. Then, as the angle of the road changed, the headlights dipped, and the slope, along with the figures, vanished from view. My mind processed the image. A group of hunters standing perfectly still, in the dark, on a steep slope. It was odd. Hunters typically moved with purpose, or at least acknowledged another vehicle. There was no sign of headlamps or reflective gear, which was standard practice for pre-dawn movement in the woods. The lack of movement was particularly unsettling. I continued around the curve, the gravel crunching under the tires. The thought persisted. What were they doing? Why were they so still? The truck's cabin felt suddenly colder, despite the defroster. I drove for another minute, perhaps a quarter mile, before the unease became too strong to ignore. I decided to turn back. There was a small pull-off just ahead, a wider section of the road where a logging spur once branched off. I maneuvered the truck into the pull-off, engaging the parking brake. The engine idled, its low rumble the only sound in the profound forest silence. I shifted into reverse, slowly backing up until I was again facing the direction from which I had come. The headlights once more swept across the leaf-off slope. This time, I was ready. I leaned forward, peering through the windshield, my eyes straining to pick out the dark forms. The fog had shifted slightly, a thin, wispy layer now clinging closer to the ground on the slope. The headlights cut through it, illuminating the bare trees and the frost-covered undergrowth. I scanned the area where I had seen them. Nothing. The slope was empty. Completely empty. There were no figures, no dark shapes, no indication that anyone had been there at all. The ground was undisturbed, a uniform expanse of fallen leaves and sparse brush. I put the truck in park, leaving the engine running. I turned off the high beams, then flicked them back on, trying to replicate the exact lighting conditions. I adjusted my position in the seat, trying to match the angle of my initial pass. Still nothing. The slope remained bare. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the outside temperature. My dash cam was mounted on the windshield, but I knew it wasn't recording. I rarely remembered to turn it on for these early morning drives. The lack of any visual evidence was frustrating. I sat there for a long moment, the truck idling, the only sound the gentle static of the two-way radio on the passenger seat. I considered getting out, walking back to the spot. But the thought of stepping out into that cold, dark forest, knowing what I had just seen, or thought I had seen, gave me pause. The isolation of the place felt heavier now. The forest, usually a source of peace, seemed to press in, silent and watchful. I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps it was a trick of the light, the fog, the shadows. The leaf-off conditions could create unusual patterns. But the sheer number of figures, their distinct upright forms, argued against a simple optical illusion. I drove forward again, slowly, passing the empty slope. I kept my eyes fixed on the area, searching for any detail I might have missed. There was nothing. The trees stood stark and still. The ground was clear. I continued on to my original destination, the logging landing. The rest of my morning hunt was uneventful, but my mind kept returning to the slope. I found myself scanning the tree line more often, listening for sounds beyond the rustle of leaves or the call of a distant bird. The quiet dread stayed with me. Later that day, after the sun was high and the fog had burned off, I drove back to the leaf-off slope. I wanted to see it in daylight, to understand what I might have misinterpreted. I parked the truck at the same spot where I had first seen the figures. I got out and walked along the edge of the road, looking down the slope. In the bright afternoon light, the area was completely visible. There were no large rocks, no oddly shaped stumps, no clusters of trees that could have mimicked the line of people. The slope was just that, a slope, covered in a thin layer of dry leaves and small saplings. I even walked a short distance down the incline, examining the ground. There were no footprints, no broken branches, no signs of recent passage by a large group. The ground was firm, and any disturbance would have been visible in the soft earth and scattered leaves. I took a few photographs with my phone, trying to capture the angles and the lay of the land, hoping to find some explanation in the images. The pictures showed only an ordinary, empty forest slope. I tried to recreate the conditions in my mind, the way the headlights would have cut through the fog, the specific angle of the truck. I drew a simple angle diagram in my logbook, attempting to map the sight lines. Nothing provided a clear answer. I considered filing a report with the local game warden, but what would I say? that I saw a dozen or more dark figures standing still on a slope in the pre-dawn fog, and then they vanished? Without any evidence, it would sound like a fabrication, or worse, a sign of mental fatigue. I decided against it. There was no evidence, no physical trace, no corroborating witness. It was just my account, my memory of a fleeting, unsettling vision. The incident remained an entry in my personal logbook, a brief, factual notation of an unexplained observation. The experience left a lasting impression. I still hunt that area, but I approach the leaf-off slope with a different kind of awareness. I drive slower, my eyes constantly scanning the tree line, especially when the fog rolls in. The quiet dread of that morning has never fully dissipated. Sometimes, when the conditions are just right, the early morning dark, the cold air, the specific way the fog hangs low, I still feel a shiver of unease as my headlights sweep across that empty slope. I look for them, even though I know they won't be there. The image of those dark, silent forms remains, a whisper in the back of my mind. I was positioned on a low hunting seat, glassing the slope above the power line cut. The air was barely above freezing, a typical autumn morning in the Appalachians. A subtle movement along the upper tree line caught my eye, something that did not quite fit the landscape. My partner, Mark, sat a few yards to my left, also scanning the ridge. We had arrived well before dawn, navigating the gravel access road in the dark. Our routine was established over many seasons, a precise placement of stands, and a clear understanding of our assigned sectors. The power line corridor offered a long, unobstructed view up the hardwood hillside, a natural funnel for game. We wore blaze orange, a standard safety protocol, and carried our radios, checking in with the rest of our party at regular intervals. The hum of the power lines above us was a constant, low thrum, a familiar sound in this particular spot. Frost still clung to the dry leaves and the tall grasses in the cut, sparkling faintly as the sky began to lighten. The fog, a common feature in these valleys, had settled in a distinct belt, obscuring the upper trunks of the trees but leaving the lower sections clear. Our laminated club map showed our positions and the designated stands for the other 3 hunters in our group. No one was supposed to be along that specific upper margin. The first movement was indistinct, a shift in the gray-white fog where it met the darker line of the tree canopy. I raised my binoculars, adjusting the focus slowly. The fog was dense enough to obscure fine detail, but it also created a stark contrast with the exposed branches and the hint of the ridge beyond. I saw a shape, dark against the lighter mist, moving with a deliberate, unhurried pace. It appeared to be walking, tracking along the edge where the fog thinned and the trees began to dominate the view. The distance was considerable, perhaps a quarter-mile up the slope, well beyond the range of a clear shot, but within the effective range of our optics. The shape was roughly humanoid, upright, and seemed to maintain a consistent height. It moved from left to right, following the natural contour of the ridge. I lowered my binoculars for a moment, rubbing the cold metal. The air felt sharper now, carrying the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. I glanced at Mark, who was still focused on his own sector. I did not speak immediately, wanting to confirm what I was seeing before drawing his attention. There was no blaze orange visible on the figure, no flash of color that would indicate one of our party. Our protocol was strict. Always wear blaze orange when moving, even within our designated areas. The figure continued its slow, steady progress. It did not stop, did not turn, did not seem to be scanning the terrain as a hunter would. Its movement was too fluid, too continuous. It simply walked, maintaining its position along the shade line where the fog met the upper reaches of the forest. I raised my binoculars again, trying to discern more detail. The fog was a frustrating veil, allowing only an impression. The shape was slender, perhaps a little taller than an average person. It moved with a peculiar grace, almost gliding, without any apparent effort over what I knew to be uneven terrain. There were no visible arms swinging, no distinct head turning. It was a silhouette, a dark cutout against the shifting gray. I watched it for what felt like several minutes, tracing its path. It moved along a section of the ridge that was known to be steep and rocky, a place where game trails were faint and difficult to traverse. No one in our group would have chosen that specific line for a stand, nor would they be moving along it at this hour. I nudged Mark with my elbow, keeping my voice low. "Look up the cut, far right, where the fog meets the trees," I whispered. "Tell me what you see." Mark slowly shifted his binoculars, adjusting his focus. He remained silent for a long moment, his posture rigid. The hum of the power line seemed to intensify in the quiet. Then, he lowered his optics, his expression unreadable. "I see it," he said, his voice flat. "What is that?" The question hung in the cold air between us. We both watched the figure continue its deliberate traverse. It seemed to be moving at a consistent speed, neither hurrying nor lingering. The fog swirled around it at times, momentarily obscuring it before revealing its outline again. We checked our laminated map, unfolding it carefully in the dim light. Our stand locations were clearly marked, along with the general areas where the other hunters were posted. None of them were anywhere near that upper shade line. Our closest hunter, Dave, was positioned on a lower bench, well below the fog belt, about a half-mile to our left. The other two, Jim and Robert, were on the opposite ridge, separated by a deep hollow. There was no reason for anyone in our party to be in that specific location, especially not moving in that manner. The figure continued its slow, unwavering journey along the ridge, maintaining its altitude. It was a persistent, unsettling presence. I reached for my radio, pressing the transmit button. The static crackled briefly before I spoke. "Group, this is Alpha 1. Do we have anyone moving along the upper ridge, far right of the power cut, where the fog meets the tree line?" I waited, listening to the faint whisper of the forest. After a moment, Dave's voice came through, clear but slightly distorted. "Negative, Alpha 1. I'm stationary on the lower bench. No movement from my position. Why do you ask?" I heard Jim's voice next. "Negative here too, Alpha 1. We're set up on the west ridge. No one from our party is over there." Robert confirmed the same. The responses were uniform, confirming our initial assessment. No one was supposed to be there. Mark and I exchanged a look. The figure was still moving, a dark, silent shape against the shifting mist. It had covered a significant distance by now, perhaps a few hundred yards, always maintaining its peculiar, unhurried pace. It did not deviate from its path, hugging the very edge of the tree line. The implication was clear. What we were seeing was not one of us. It was not a deer, nor a bear, nor any other animal we recognized. Its upright posture and consistent movement were distinctly human-like, yet utterly devoid of any human characteristic we could identify. The cold seemed to deepen, and the hum of the power lines felt more pronounced, a low, vibrating presence in the quiet morning. We decided to maintain our positions, but keep a constant watch on the figure. Our radios remained open, ready for immediate communication. We discussed the possibility of another hunting party, but the area was part of our club's leased land, and we were the only ones scheduled to be out that day. Furthermore, any responsible hunter would be wearing blaze orange and would respond to a radio call. This figure wore nothing visible, and it remained silent. It was an anomaly, a breach in the expected order of the forest. The sun was beginning to climb higher, but the fog persisted, clinging to the upper slopes, creating a natural boundary that the figure seemed determined to follow. After another period of observation, the figure reached a point where the ridge curved sharply, leading into a dense stand of pines. It moved into the shadows of the evergreens, and then, as if absorbed by the forest itself, it simply vanished. There was no sudden movement, no quick dash for cover. It just faded from view, seamlessly integrating with the dark, thick foliage. We continued to watch the spot for several minutes, our binoculars fixed on the last known location. Nothing reappeared. The fog continued to swirl, and the trees stood silent. The absence was as unsettling as its presence had been. We waited for about an hour, scanning the area repeatedly before making a decision. We needed to investigate, but cautiously. We radioed the rest of the group, explaining the situation in calm, factual terms. We emphasized the lack of blaze orange and the unusual movement. We decided to approach the area from below, maintaining a safe distance, while Dave would move to a higher vantage point on his bench to provide overwatch. Jim and Robert would remain on the opposite ridge, ready to assist if needed. Our plan was procedural: approach, observe, report. We packed our gear, ensuring our radios were secure and our blaze orange was fully visible. The cold air felt heavy, and the gravel crunched under our boots as we began our ascent. The climb was steep, the ground covered in a thick layer of dry leaves that rustled with every step. We moved slowly, deliberately, our eyes constantly scanning the terrain ahead and above. The hum of the power lines faded behind us as we gained altitude, replaced by the quiet sounds of the forest. We reached the power line cut itself, a wide swath of cleared land, and began to move along its edge, heading towards the point where we had last seen the figure. The fog was still present, though it seemed to be lifting slightly, revealing more of the tree trunks and the rocky outcrops. We maintained a wide berth from the tree line, always aware of the possibility of an unexpected encounter. As we neared the area, we found no tracks, no disturbed leaves, no broken branches. The ground was a mix of hard-packed earth and leaf litter, but there was nothing to indicate that anything had passed through. We spread out, moving in a careful grid pattern, searching for any sign. We checked the base of the pines where the figure had disappeared. The needles were thick and undisturbed. There was no evidence of a camp, no discarded items, no footprint. It was as if the figure had never been there, despite our clear, shared observation. Dave reported nothing from his overwatch position, only the shifting fog and the silent trees. The isolation of the forest felt more profound now, the quiet more absolute. We spent another hour meticulously searching the area, covering the ground where the figure had moved and the immediate vicinity of its disappearance. We found nothing. No evidence remained. We took a few photographs of the terrain, documenting the fog line and the tree canopy for our report. The lack of any physical trace was deeply unsettling. It defied explanation. We eventually regrouped, our radios crackling with the silence of unconfirmed observations. We filed a detailed report with the club, outlining the incident, the radio log, and our observations. The official file noted, "Unidentified movement, no corroborating evidence." The incident was logged, but never explained. I still think about that morning, the cold air, the hum of the lines, and the silent, pacing shape along the shade line. The image of it, moving with that peculiar, unhurried grace, remains vivid. I sometimes hear the whisper of the wind through the pines and wonder if it is still there, just beyond the edge of sight, waiting for the fog to roll in again. I was checking the perimeter of my property, a routine task I performed every few days. The air held the sharp chill of late autumn, just before the first hard frost. A recurring detail in recent hunter reports had begun to trouble me. I own a substantial tract of land in the Appalachian foothills, mostly hardwood forest and some cleared fields. For years, hunters have leased sections during deer season, individuals who know the terrain well. This past autumn, a pattern of reports emerged from several different groups. They spoke of a figure, always seen in the early morning, always near the same field corner. This specific spot was prone to heavy fog banks, especially after a cold night, the mist often contour-hugging the low ground. The descriptions were vague, consistent only in the presence of a standing shape. It was never fully clear, always partially obscured by the mist. They described it as tall, indistinct, sometimes appearing to move slowly. Other times, it seemed to stand perfectly still, watching. The hunters were unnerved, some even cutting their hunts short. They mentioned a feeling of being observed, a quiet presence that settled over the area. I decided to investigate these claims myself. My first step was to deploy a trail camera. I wanted objective evidence of whatever was causing the disturbance. Something concrete to either confirm or dismiss their stories. I chose a high-resolution infrared model, known for its clarity in low light conditions. My routine involved regular patrols of the property lines and game trails. I checked on the condition of the logging landings and ridge breaks. This land has been in my family for generations, and I understand its rhythms. The autumn months bring a particular kind of quiet to the forest. The leaves fall, opening up sight lines that were previously obscured. The air becomes crisp, carrying sounds further. Fog is a common feature here, especially in the valleys and low-lying areas. It often rolls in from the river, settling into the hollows before dawn. I am accustomed to its presence, its silent white waves. I know how it can play tricks on the eyes, distorting distances and shapes. My experience with wildlife and the environment is extensive. I have encountered many strange sights over the years, mostly explainable phenomena. I have seen deer standing perfectly still, mistaken for stumps. I have heard the wind mimic voices through the trees. My approach to these reports was entirely practical. I believed there was a logical explanation, perhaps a misidentified animal or a trick of light. The trail cam would provide an unbiased record. It would capture anything that moved within its field of view, day or night. I positioned the trail camera on a sturdy oak tree overlooking the field corner. It was a strategic spot, elevated slightly, offering a clear view of where the fog typically gathered. The camera was secured with a heavy-duty strap, angled to capture the specific area of interest. I activated its motion sensor and set it to record short video clips, followed by a burst of still photographs. This setup would ensure I captured both movement and detailed images. The first week passed without incident. The weather remained clear, and the camera recorded only deer and a few raccoons. Then, a cold front moved through, bringing with it the conditions conducive to heavy fog. I returned to the camera after about 3 days of this weather pattern. The air was still damp, and a faint mist lingered in the deeper hollows. I carefully unstrapped the camera and retrieved the memory card. Back at my cabin, I inserted the card into my laptop. The screen displayed a sequence of images. I began reviewing the files methodically. The initial frames showed the familiar forest floor, the field edge, and the distant ridge flank. Then, the fog began to appear. It rolled in slowly, a silent white wave creeping across the landscape. The camera's infrared illuminators activated, casting an eerie glow on the swirling mist. The images showed the fog thickening, obscuring the trees, then thinning again. Hundreds of photographs documented the ebb and flow of the mist. I scrolled through them, hour after hour, day after day. My eyes scanned every frame, searching for any anomaly. I saw the bare branches of the hardwoods, their silhouettes softened by the vapor. I saw the texture of the fog itself, a dense, featureless wall of white. I expected to see something, even a fleeting glimpse. The hunters had been specific about the location. They had pointed to the exact spot where they saw the shape standing. I knew precisely where to look in the camera's frame. Yet, there was nothing. No solid body, no distinct outline, no movement that suggested a human or even a large animal. The camera recorded only the environment. It captured the subtle shifts in light as dawn approached, the way the fog diffused the sun's first rays. It showed the frost forming on the leaves, glistening briefly before melting. The click of viewer buttons was the only consistent noise. I reviewed the video clips as well. They were short, about 10 seconds each, triggered by motion. The videos showed the fog drifting, the trees swaying gently in a light breeze. The infrared vision rendered the scene in stark black and white, enhancing contrast. Still, no figure. I paused frames, zoomed in on areas where the fog was less dense. I adjusted the brightness and contrast settings on my laptop. Each adjustment only confirmed the absence. The camera had functioned perfectly. Its motion sensor was working, capturing animals that passed through. Yet, in the very moments and locations where the hunters reported seeing a figure, the camera showed only an empty, swirling void of mist. It was as if the figure existed only in the perception of the observers. The sheer volume of fog-filled, empty frames became unsettling. I redeployed the camera differently. I moved it to a neighboring tree about 20 yards away to get a different angle on the field corner. I added a second, smaller camera hidden deeper in the undergrowth. This second camera was set to a wider field of view. I also started visiting the location myself more frequently, especially during the early morning hours when the fog was most prevalent. I wanted to experience the conditions firsthand. Early morning visits became routine. I would arrive before dawn, parking my truck a short distance away on the gravel access road. I would then walk the trail in, moving quietly through the leaf litter. The cold was biting, barely above freezing. I would stand near the field corner, observing the fog as it rolled in. It was an immersive experience, the world reduced to gray and white. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional rustle of a small animal or the distant hum of the highway. I spent hours there, watching the mist swirl and dissipate. I tried to imagine what the hunters had seen, to put myself in their position. I looked for anything that could be mistaken for a human form. Nothing presented itself as a clear candidate. I retrieved the memory cards from both cameras every few days. The results were consistent. The main camera, now from a new angle, still recorded only fog, trees, and occasional wildlife. The second camera, with its wider view, showed the same. There were no figures, no anomalies, no unexplained movements. The sheer volume of empty footage became a pattern. Two cameras, different perspectives, over an extended period, captured nothing. I began to feel a growing sense of unease. The reports were too consistent, too numerous, to be entirely dismissed as imagination. Yet, my objective evidence showed nothing. I spoke with a few of the hunters again, pressing for more details. They described the figure as dark against the lighter fog, sometimes appearing to have a faint outline. They spoke of a feeling of intense isolation when they saw it, a sense of being utterly alone with this silent presence. One hunter mentioned a faint whisper, almost like the wind, but distinct. It was a low, sustained sound from within the fog itself. This detail was new, and it added another layer to the mystery. My cameras, of course, recorded no sound. They were passive visual observers. The lack of any visual confirmation, combined with these persistent, unsettling reports, created a disquieting paradox. I had exhausted my technical means of investigation. The trail cam, designed to capture the unseen, confirmed only an absence. I eventually removed both cameras from the field corner. The season was drawing to a close, and the fog patterns were becoming less frequent. I had accumulated a significant file of photographs and video clips, all showing the same thing: an empty, fog-shrouded landscape. My logbook contained detailed notes on camera placement, weather conditions, and hunter statements. The evidence was clear, yet contradictory. There was no physical proof of a figure, but the consistent reports from multiple, reliable individuals could not be ignored. I shared my findings with a local game warden, outlining the situation. He acknowledged the strangeness of it, but had no official protocol for such an occurrence. There was no crime, no missing person, just an unsettling series of observations. The official notes remained inconclusive. Even now, when the autumn fog rolls in and settles over the low ground, I think of that field corner. I remember the silent white waves, the bare trees, and the empty frames on my laptop screen. The memory of where people pointed to a standing shape remains vivid. I still walk those trails, especially in the early morning mist. I listen for any sound beyond the wind, any whisper carried on the cold air. The forest holds its secrets, and some of them resist all attempts at capture. I was part of a small hunting party. We were on our final day of a deer hunt in the Appalachian foothills. A sharp cold had settled in just before dawn. The fog was unlike anything I had seen before. Our group consisted of 4 experienced hunters. We had spent the previous 4 days in the same block of forest, familiar with its hardwood slopes and winding game trails. We knew the logging landings and the ridge breaks like the back of our hands. This was our final morning, a last chance before packing up the vehicles and heading home. We had a system, a set of protocols developed over years of hunting together. Safety was always paramount, especially regarding visibility and shot placement. We always wore blaze orange, and our radio checks were frequent and precise. We had experienced a few near misreads earlier in the week, moments where a shadow or a distant movement almost led to a mistaken identification. Those incidents had heightened our caution. We relied on clear sight lines, especially with the leaves off the trees, to ensure ethical and safe hunting. The plan for this morning was to occupy our linked stands, positioned over various fields, hollows, and cuts within our designated block. We would wait for first light, hoping for a final opportunity. The drive-in that morning was slow, the headlights of my truck cutting weak paths through the thickening air. The gravel road felt slick under the tires, already damp with the heavy moisture. We parked our vehicles at the main landing, the engines idling for a few moments before we killed them, plunging the area into a deeper silence. The cold was immediate, a damp chill that seeped through our layers. We checked our radios one last time, the low hum of the static a familiar comfort. Then we separated, each heading to our pre-assigned stand, moving through the pre-dawn dark. I reached my stand, a sturdy platform overlooking a narrow cut that led into a deeper hollow. The fog was already dense, clinging to the contours of the land. It wasn't a typical morning mist that burned off with the rising sun. This fog felt heavy, almost solid, a physical presence that absorbed sound and light. I settled in, my rifle resting across my lap, the cold metal biting through my gloves. The usual sounds of the forest were absent. There was no rustle of leaves, no distant bird calls, just the oppressive silence of the fog. I tried to peer through the gloom, but visibility was severely limited. I could barely make out the nearest trees, perhaps 20 yards away. Beyond that, everything dissolved into a featureless gray. I clicked my radio, a quick check-in. "Anyone seeing anything?" I asked, keeping my voice low. The replies came back, one after another, all confirming the same poor conditions. "Zero visibility here," one voice reported. "Can't see a thing," another added. We agreed to hold our positions for a while, hoping the sun would eventually break through. As the morning progressed, the fog showed no signs of lifting. If anything, it seemed to thicken, pressing in closer. I started to notice things, small irregularities that pricked at my attention. Shapes would form at the very edge of my limited sight, vague outlines that seemed to shift and coalesce. They were never distinct enough to identify, but they were there, just beyond the threshold of recognition. I found myself staring intently into the gray, trying to resolve the forms, but they always remained indistinct. A faint whisper of static came over my radio. "Did anyone just see that?" It was Mark, positioned about 300 yards down the hollow. His voice was tight. "Saw what?" I asked, my own voice a little sharper than I intended. "A shadow," he replied. "Moved across the cut. Too fast for a deer. Too low for a bird." There was a pause, then he added, "And it didn't look right." I scanned my own area, but saw nothing new. The cold seemed to deepen, a raw dampness that penetrated my clothing. About an hour later, another call came in, this time from David, who was on a ridge overlooking a small field. "I'm seeing something," he reported, his voice hushed. "It's moving along the far tree line, but it's not following the trail. It's moving against the slope, almost floating." He described a form that seemed to absorb light, a darker patch within the already dark fog. It wasn't reflecting any of the diffused light, making it appear as a void. This was unsettling. We had all seen deer move through fog, their forms softened but still recognizable. This was different. The isolation in my stand became more profound. The silence was no longer peaceful, it felt watchful. I kept scanning, trying to catch a glimpse of what Mark and David were describing. I saw nothing definitive, but the vague, shifting shapes at the periphery of my vision seemed to intensify. They were never still, always just beyond clear focus, like something half-remembered from a dream. The air itself felt heavy, charged with an unseen presence. My breath plumed out in thick clouds, quickly swallowed by the mist. We had always prided ourselves on our safety protocols, our clear understanding of range and visibility. The fog had rendered all of that useless. We couldn't trust our sight lines. We couldn't even trust our ears, as the fog muffled and distorted every sound. The memory of our recent near misreads weighed heavily. We had a strict rule. If you can't identify your target with absolute certainty, you don't shoot. In these conditions, absolute certainty was impossible. The decision was forming in my mind, and I knew it was forming in the others as well. I keyed my radio. "I think we need to pull out," I stated, my voice calm but firm. "Visibility is not improving. We can't make a safe shot." There was a moment of silence, then Mark's voice came back. Agreed. I'm seeing too much that doesn't make sense. David chimed in next. Same here. I'm not comfortable. Let's call it. We quickly coordinated our exit. The plan was to meet back at the main logging landing, ensuring everyone was accounted for. The procedural focus helped to keep the unease at bay, at least for a moment. I carefully packed my gear, the movements deliberate and quiet. Descending from the stand, my boots crunched softly on the frost-covered ground. The fog felt even thicker at ground level, a cold, wet blanket. I started my walk back, following the familiar game trail. But the trail itself seemed different, less defined by the pervasive mist. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig was amplified and distorted. I found myself pausing frequently, listening intently, trying to discern if the sounds were natural or something else. I thought I heard a faint whisper, just at the edge of hearing, carried on the damp air. It wasn't a voice, more like a breath, a soft exhalation that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. I stopped, holding my breath, straining to hear it again. The forest was utterly silent once more, the fog absorbing all sound. I continued walking, my pace a little faster now, my senses on high alert. I scanned the tree line, searching for any movement, any break in the monotonous gray. I noticed something then, a series of broken branches on a sapling, too high for a deer, too clean for a bear. They looked as if something had brushed past them with significant force. I stopped to examine them, my gloved hand feeling the fresh breaks. There were no clear tracks in the soft earth nearby, only the faint impressions of my own boots. The hum I had heard earlier, a low, almost imperceptible vibration, seemed to return, a subtle presence in the air around me. It was not static from the radio, but something deeper, more resonant. Finally, I saw the faint glow of headlights through the fog, a welcome sight. The vehicles at the landing were a beacon of normalcy. Mark and David were already there, their forms emerging from the mist. We quickly accounted for everyone, a silent nod of relief passing between us. The air around the trucks felt slightly less oppressive, perhaps because of the familiar hum of the idling engines. We gathered around the tailgate of my truck, the fog still swirling around us, but now we were together. We debriefed, each of us sharing our experiences. Mark described the shadowy figures he had seen, their unnatural speed and movement. David recounted the light-absorbing form that seemed to float along the ridge. I spoke of the strange silence, the broken branches, and the faint, unsettling hum. The common thread was clear. Unidentifiable shapes, unusual movements, and an oppressive, watchful silence. We all agreed that the fog itself had felt wrong. Not just a weather phenomenon, but something more. We reviewed our visibility chart, a simple drawing we kept in the logbook. It showed our typical range of sight in various conditions. Today, that range was almost zero. The decision to pull out had been unanimous and immediate. We had all felt the same quiet dread, the same deep-seated unease. It wasn't just about not seeing deer. It was about not trusting what we thought we saw. The shade lines, usually a guide, had become a source of profound distrust. We had held fire because we could not be sure. The drive out was quiet, the fog still clinging to the highway in places, making the familiar road seem alien. We filed a report with the hunting club, detailing the unusual fog conditions and our decision to stand down for safety reasons. We included a note about the limited visibility and the general feeling of unease. There was no clear explanation for the fog's behavior or the perceived shapes within it. The evidence was our shared testimony, recorded in the club's logbook. I still think about that day. The way the fog just sat there, watching. The silence it imposed, the shapes it created. I still hear that faint, low hum sometimes, just at the edge of my hearing, when the air is still and the light is low. If this story pulled you in, make sure to subscribe. We post new ones every day, steady as a campfire burning in the dark. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from and which part of tonight's story stayed with you the most. It's always wild seeing what hits people across different places.